Hello everyone, and welcome to Dr. Bonechill. Before we dive in, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on the bell. You won't want to miss what's coming. Also tell me, where in the world are you watching from? And is it dark outside yet?
I'm not crazy. I know how these things sound. But 6 months ago, I still believed that monsters were just stories. The house was perfect. 3 acres of pine forest in northern Washington, far enough from Seattle to feel like an escape. My wife Sarah was 7 months pregnant with our first child, a boy we'd already named Michael. She'd been dreaming of raising him somewhere green and quiet. We moved in on a Tuesday in late September. The previous owners had left in a hurry. Job opportunity in California, the realtor said. They'd left furniture, books, even family photos. I thought it was convenient. I didn't think about what makes you abandon everything like a sinking ship. The first week was perfect. We spent our nights watching sunsets paint the pine trees gold. But at night, alone, while Sarah slept, I'd hear footsteps, heavy and deliberate, circling the house. I told myself it was deer, bears, anything with a name I could understand. The scratching started on the 8th night. I woke to Sarah gripping my arm, eyes wide. A slow scraping sound moved along the siding below our window, left to right, silence, then right to left. "What is that?" she whispered. I grabbed the flashlight and went outside. I swept the beam across the house. Nothing, but in the soft dirt beneath the window, I saw footprints. They were massive, twice the size of my own feet. Almost human, with 5 distinct toes, but elongated and impossibly wide. They faced the window directly, as if something had stood there, perfectly still, looking up at where my pregnant wife slept. I should have left then, but I convinced myself it was a bear and went back inside. The scratching returned the next night, on multiple sides of the house at once. I started staying up, sitting in the dark with a baseball bat, watching the windows. On the 3rd night, just after 2 a.m., I saw it. Something stepped from between 2 pines, about 50 yards away. It was tall, at least 8 feet, broad-shouldered and covered in dark hair. But it was the way it moved that paralyzed me. It walked with purpose, with intelligence, each step deliberate and silent. It stared at the house. At me, I couldn't move. The thing stood there for 30 seconds, head tilted as if listening. Then slowly, it raised one massive arm and pointed directly at me. I fumbled with my phone and snapped a photo as it melted back into the forest. I sent it to my brother, a wildlife biologist. His response: "Where did you take this? Don't go outside. Call me now." But I didn't call. Instead, I went to the basement. The previous owners had left boxers. In the 8th box, I found a journal. The handwriting started normal but became frantic. One entry from 6 months before we moved in read, "It knows we're leaving. I saw it at the tree line watching the moving truck. It's been getting closer every night. Last night I found scratches on Michael's window, not random scratches. They formed patterns. We have to leave before it takes what it's been waiting for." My hands shook. Michael. They'd named their son Michael, too. And the wife's name was Sarah. The last entry. "It came to the window last night, pressed its face against the glass, and looked at my son. Its eyes were ancient, and they knew me. It spoke without words. It said it's been waiting, that this land is its land. It said it would take what was owed. If you're reading this, leave. Don't try to understand. Just take your family and run." I heard Sarah scream. I burst into our bedroom. Sarah sat up, hands on her stomach, face white. "Michael kicked," she said, voice hollow. But that wasn't a kick. It was too hard, like he was trying to push his way out. Then I saw them. 3 of them, standing in a perfect triangle around our house. Our home suddenly felt very small. I understood then. It wasn't waiting for us. It was waiting for Michael. For our son. This land had some ancient claim I couldn't understand. We left that night, drove down the mountain at 3 a.m. with Sarah crying. In the rearview mirror, 3 tall shapes stood in our driveway, watching. We never went back. The house has been on the market for 4 months. No one will buy it. Sarah gave birth to Michael 6 weeks later in Portland. He's healthy and perfect. But sometimes, late at night, I catch him staring at the window with an intensity no infant should have. And I swear I hear scratching, even though we're on the 4th floor. The worst part is knowing it's still out there, still waiting, and wondering if we ever really left at all. Or if we just took the forest with us, carried in our son's eyes, and the scratches I hear that no one else does. Because once they know you, once they've marked you, distance doesn't matter. They live in the spaces you can't see, in the corners of your vision, in the moment between sleeping and waking, and on nights when the scratching is louder and Michael won't stop staring at the window. I wonder if running was ever really an option at all. I used to be a skeptic, the kind of person who rolled his eyes at ghost stories and laughed at conspiracy theories. I had a degree in environmental science, a government job cataloging wildlife populations, and a rock-solid belief that everything could be explained by logic and data. That confidence died on a Tuesday in March, somewhere in the Cascade Mountains, when I answered a call that was never meant for human ears. My name is David Chun, and I've worked for the Washington State Department of Fish and Wildlife for 11 years. My job is simple: hike into remote areas, set up motion-activated cameras, collect data on animal populations, and file reports. It's solitary work, which is exactly why I love it. The assignment seemed routine. A series of elk had gone missing from a valley about 40 miles northeast of Mount Rainier. I was supposed to spend 5 days in the backcountry, placing cameras and collecting evidence. I drove up on a Monday morning and started the 8-mile hike to base camp. The weather was perfect, cool and clear. By late afternoon, I had my tent set up in a clearing beside a creek. I spent the remaining daylight setting up my first 3 cameras. That night, sitting by my campfire eating freeze-dried chili, I felt completely at peace. This was my element, my sanctuary. Out here, everything made sense. Predator and prey, cause and effect, the elegant simplicity of natural law. The first camera triggered at 2:47 in the morning. My monitoring device beeped, pulling me from sleep. I pulled out my tablet and accessed the camera's feed. Standing directly in front of the camera, no more than 6 feet away, was something massive. At first, my brain tried to categorize it as a bear standing upright, but the proportions were wrong. The arms were too long, the shoulders too broad, and the head was the wrong shape. It was looking directly into the camera, as if it knew exactly where the lens was positioned. I zoomed in on the face. The features were too human. Not human, but too close, like an evolutionary branch that split from ours millions of years ago. The eyes reflected the infrared flash with bright white glow, and even through the grainy image, I could see intelligence. It stood there for 43 seconds. Then it turned and walked away upright, with a gait that was disturbingly smooth and purposeful. I didn't sleep. I sat in my tent with my satellite phone and bear spray, listening to the forest. At first light, I hiked to the camera location. The camera was untouched, but the undergrowth was crushed in a circle about 15 feet wide, as if something large had been pacing. There were tracks, dozens of them, pressed deep into the earth. I measured one. 18 inches long, 7 inches wide, with 5 clear toe impressions. The depth suggested something over 400 pounds. I took photos and measurements, approaching it scientifically because that was the only way I could process what I was seeing. I should have left. Instead, I decided to set up more cameras. If this was real, I needed more evidence. This could be the discovery of the century. Pride is a dangerous thing in the wilderness. I spent the day setting up 8 more cameras in a grid pattern around the valley. By sunset, my surveillance network was complete. That night, the cameras started triggering in sequence. First, the northern camera at 8:32 p.m., showing the massive figure walking through. 7 minutes later, the eastern camera triggered. Then south, then west. It was walking in a large circle around my camp. I watched on my tablet as it completed the circuit. Then, at 9:47 p.m., every single camera triggered simultaneously. All 11 of them, showing the same thing. 11 of them, each standing perfectly still in front of a different camera, all facing toward me. This wasn't random behavior. This was coordinated. They knew I was there. They knew I was watching, and they were showing me that they were watching back. I stepped out of my tent and called into the darkness. I know you're out there. I know you can understand me. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, from 11 different directions at once, I heard it. A call that started low and resonant, then rose into frequencies that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. The sound vibrated through the ground and air. When it stopped, the silence was absolute. Then I heard movement all around my camp, branches breaking, heavy footfalls moving in perfect synchronization. They were closing the circle. My tablet chimed. The camera on the trail to my truck showed 7 of them standing shoulder to shoulder, blocking the path. They weren't moving toward me. They were making sure I couldn't leave. I understood then. They wanted me to know I was in their territory, there by their permission, and that permission could be revoked. I spent that night listening to them move around my camp. At dawn, they were gone, but the tracks circled my camp in rings, each one closer than the last. The final ring stopped exactly 15 feet from my tent. I decided to stay one more night. That evening, I set up a voice recorder. As darkness fell, the calling started again from directly behind my tent, and buried in those frequencies were words. Not English, but structured communication. Language. The calling stopped. Then a voice, deep and distorted but attempting human speech, came from the darkness. David Chun, it knew my name. David Chun, leave. Tomorrow, leave. Not safe. Others coming. Not kind. It wasn't threatening me. It was warning me. The ones surrounding my camp were the friendly ones. At first light, I packed and hiked out. Nothing followed me, or if it did, it stayed hidden. 2 weeks later, search and rescue found that young couple I'd passed on the trail, what was left of them. The official report said bear attack, but I saw the photos. I saw the tracks and how their tent had been carefully unzipped from the outside. I quit a month later. I couldn't go back into those mountains, couldn't risk hearing that voice again. Or worse, hearing what the unkind ones sounded like. I still have the recordings, evidence I can't share, but late at night, I listen to that voice. David Chun, leave, tomorrow. And I wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed. The worst part is the dreams. Every night, I'm back in that tent, hearing my name called from the darkness. But in the dreams, I don't leave. I step outside and see them clearly, and they're not warning me anymore. They're welcoming me. I grew up believing that the past was fixed, immutable, something you could study but never touch. My grandfather was a history professor who built his life on facts and evidence. He used to say that the dead stay dead, and their stories only live on in the marks they leave behind. I wish he'd been right. My name is Marcus Webb, and I'm a trail maintenance supervisor for the Oregon Parks Department. I spend my days clearing fallen trees and repairing bridges, making sure hikers can safely enjoy the wilderness. It's simple, physical labor that lets my mind wander while my hands stay busy. The Whispering Ridge Trail was supposed to be a routine job, 23 miles of backcountry path that hadn't been maintained in 3 years due to budget cuts. A week-long solo trip through old-growth forest, sleeping rough and taking notes. Exactly the kind of work I loved. I should have wondered why nobody else wanted the assignment. The trail started innocuously enough, winding through Douglas fir and western hemlock, following an old creek bed. The first day was perfect, cool and overcast, with soft light that made the forest feel like a cathedral. But as I pushed deeper into the backcountry, I started noticing things that didn't fit. According to my maps, surveyed just 5 years ago, the path should have been overgrown and choked with brush. Instead, it was clear, as if someone had been keeping it open despite the Park Service's neglect. I radioed the ranger station that evening. The dispatcher, Helen, went quiet when I described the trail's condition. "That's strange," she said slowly. "We haven't had any volunteer groups out there. Be careful. That trail has a history. People used to disappear on it back in the 70s and 80s. That night, I heard footsteps for the first time. Heavy and deliberate, pacing back and forth, just beyond the reach of my firelight. I called out, thinking maybe it was another hiker, but received no answer. Just the steady rhythm of footfalls, walking the same path over and over like a sentry on patrol. The footsteps continued for 20 minutes, then stopped abruptly. I woke before dawn to find my camp undisturbed, but in the soft dirt around my campsite were tracks forming a perfect circle around where I de-slept. Each print was deep and clear and unmistakably large, at least 16 inches long with 5 distinct toes. The second day of hiking was when things got truly strange. The trail began to change in small ways that accumulated like drops of water wearing away stone. Trees ID marked with flagging tape were suddenly 10 or 15 feet from where I remembered placing them. Landmarks shifted position. A distinctive boulder shaped like a sitting bear appeared on my right when my notes clearly stated it should have been on my left. By midday, I reached a section that stopped me cold. According to my map, there should have been a wooden bridge crossing a ravine here. Built in 1998 and noted as structurally sound in the last survey. Instead, there was nothing. No bridge, no remnants of posts or planking, not even the concrete footings. But there were marks in the stone on both sides of the ravine. Deep grooves as if something incredibly heavy had been dragged across solid granite repeatedly, wearing channels over years or decades. I scrambled down into the ravine and back up the other side, driven by stubborn refusal to let the trail beat me. The afternoon brought me to a section of trail that shouldn't have existed at all. According to historical records, this part of Whispering Ridge had burned in a wildfire in 1979. The entire area should have been regenerated forest with young trees and thick underbrush. Instead, I was walking through old growth with trees that had to be 300 years old. Standing tall and healthy as if fire had never touched them, and carved into the bark of these trees were marks. Not natural scarring from animals or weather, but deliberate cuts forming patterns I didn't recognize. They reminded me of Pacific Northwest indigenous petroglyphs my grandfather had shown me. But these patterns were too complex and intricate. Covering hundreds of trees in a systematic grid, that's when I found the first skeleton. It was partially buried in the undergrowth, bones scattered and weathered but still clearly identifiable as human. The backpack lying nearby was modern, maybe 10 or 15 years old, still partially intact despite years of exposure. Inside, I found a wallet with a driver's license issued to Robert Chun. Expired in 2012. I radioed the ranger station, my voice surprisingly steady as I reported the discovery. Helen's response was immediate and urgent. "Marcus, I need you to mark the location and get out of there now." Don't spend another night on that trail. There are 17 documented missing persons on that trail since 1970. We've never recovered any of them. Please, start hiking back. But it was already late afternoon, and I was at least 12 miles from the trailhead. There was no way I could make it back before nightfall. I told Helen I'd hike as far as I could and camp somewhere near the trail entrance. The sun was setting, painting the forest in shades that looked too much like blood, and the shadows were growing long and strange. That's when I realized I was being followed by many things. I didn't look. Some instinct older than reason told me that looking would be a mistake, that as long as I kept my eyes on the trail and kept moving, I might survive this. I burst into a clearing I didn't remember from the map and stopped dead. They looked ancient, covered in moss and lichen, carved with the same intricate patterns I'd seen on the trees. And surrounding the stone circle, standing perfectly still in the fading light, were dozens of them. They were tall and impossibly tall, covered in dark hair that seemed to absorb what little light remained. But it was their posture that froze me in place. They weren't standing like animals. Heads bowed and hands clasped, arranged in concentric rings around the stones. This was a sacred space, and I was intruding on something I wasn't meant to see. Even in the dim light, I could see its eyes, dark and deep and filled with something I can only describe as sorrow. Dropped my pack, kept only my radio and phone, and sprinted through that gap in the trees as branches whipped my face and roots tried to trip me. Dozens of voices rising in harmony, wordless but structured, beautiful and terrible and old beyond measure. They were singing for the dead, for Robert Chun and the 16 others who'd disappeared on this trail. For all the people who'd wandered into sacred spaces they didn't understand and never left. I don't remember much about the next hour. I ran until my legs gave out, then crawled, then dragged myself forward. Because the singing stopped and the forest went quiet, and I was suddenly on a section of trail I recognized, only a mile from the parking area. The recovery team found me just after midnight, hypothermic and delirious, but alive. No bones, no backpack, no evidence anyone had ever died in that location. When I showed them the photos on my camera, every single image from that second day showed nothing but gray static. The official report stated that I'd experienced altitude sickness and exposure-induced hallucinations. The Park Service closed Whispering Ridge Trail indefinitely, citing safety concerns. I never went back to trail maintenance because now, when I look at a path through the forest, I see history, layer upon layer of it, soaked into the earth like blood. I see the ghosts of everyone who walked before, and I hear the footsteps of things that have been walking these mountains since before we had names for them. And sometimes, late at night, when the city is quiet and sleep won't come, I hear the singing again, distant and faint, carried on a wind that smells like cedar and old smoke. Voices raised in harmony for the lost and the gone and the forgotten. The trail remembers, and now, so do I. I used to believe that cameras never lie, that a photograph was pure truth and objective reality frozen in pixels. Light hits sensor, image forms, end of story. For 15 years, I built my career on that belief. Document T-I-N-G. Wildlife for National Geographic and Smithsonian, publications that demanded absolute authenticity. That certainty shattered on a cold November morning in the Olympic Peninsula, when my camera showed me something that couldn't exist, and I understood that some truths are too terrible to photograph. My name is Daniel Wright, and I'm a wildlife photographer, or I was. I'm not sure what I am anymore. The assignment came through my agent in late October. A private conservation group wanted documentation of the temperate rainforests in western Washington, specifically focusing on old-growth ecosystems and their inhabitants. The pay was exceptional, the timeline generous, and the location remote enough to promise the kind of pristine shots that won awards. I should have asked why they were willing to pay so much for what seemed like a standard documentation project. I drove up to the peninsula on a Tuesday, my truck loaded with gear worth more than most people's cars. 3 camera bodies, a dozen lenses, tripods, remote triggers, enough batteries and memory cards to shoot for weeks. I was prepared for anything nature could throw at me, except what was actually waiting. The area was pristine and untouched by logging or development. A valley where Sitka spruce grew to heights that made you feel like an insect, and moss covered everything in a thick carpet of impossible green. I set up base camp in a clearing near a creek, establishing my routine with practiced efficiency. Wake at dawn, shoot in the morning light, rest during midday, shoot again in the golden hour before sunset. The first 3 days were perfect. My shots were good, better than good, the kind of images that told stories without words. I felt that familiar excitement, the photographer's high when everything clicks and you know you're creating something special. Then I started finding the prints. The first one appeared on the 4th morning, placed carefully on a flat rock about 50 yards from my camp. It was enormous, at least 16 inches long, pressed deep into the moss with the kind of weight that suggested something massive. But it was the placement that bothered me, as if someone had put it there specifically for me to find. I photographed it from multiple angles. Took measurements, collected a soil sample, professional documentation, treating it like any other field observation. But my hands were shaking as I worked. The second print appeared that afternoon, on a fallen log directly in the path ID taken to reach a particular grove of old-growth cedar. Again, perfectly placed and impossible to miss. I was being guided or herded, and something about the deliberate nature of it made my skin crawl. That night, I reviewed my photos on my laptop, scanning through the day's work with a critical eye. Most were good and solid shots that would work well in the final documentation. But there were anomalies in perhaps a dozen images, shadows in the background that didn't quite match the light angles. Shapes in the tree line that seemed somehow wrong and too symmetrical. I zoomed in on one image of a particularly impressive Sitka spruce. There, barely visible in the deep shadows behind the tree, was what looked like a face. Not quite human and not quite animal, but something in between. Eyes reflecting the flash at an angle that suggested they'd been looking directly at my camera when I took the shot. The next morning, I made a decision that still haunts me. I was going to track whatever was making those prints, not aggressively and not as a hunter, but as a documentarian. I'd follow at a respectful distance, observe, photograph if possible, and capture proof of what every instinct was telling me couldn't be real. The prints led deeper into the forest, away from established trails, and into areas where the undergrowth grew thick, and the canopy blocked most of the light. By midday, I'd tracked the prints to a ravine about 3 miles from my camp. At the bottom of the ravine, I found something that made me forget about the prints entirely. A tree, dead and massive, had fallen to create a natural bridge across a narrow gorge. But the tree had been modified with branches stripped away and the trunk carved. It's covered in symbols and patterns that reminded me of petroglyphs. But these weren't ancient. The cuts were relatively fresh, made within the last few years or maybe months. I was so focused on photographing the carvings that I did and noticed the silence until it was absolute. No birds, no insects, no wind. The forest had gone still the way prey animals go still when a predator is near. I lowered my camera and looked around, my heart suddenly hammering in my chest. That's when I saw them. Not one, but 4 of them, standing at the cardinal points around the ravine and perfectly positioned to surround me. They were massive, easily 8 feet tall, covered in dark brown hair that seemed to shift and blend with the shadows. But it was the way they stood that paralyzed me, not aggressive or threatening, but watchful and patient. I raised my camera slowly and carefully, the professional in me overriding the terrified human. This was the shot of a lifetime. The largest one, standing to my north, shook its head in a clear and deliberate gesture. No. I froze, with my finger on the shutter button, caught between desire and disbelief. It had understood what my camera was, and had communicated a clear preference, waiting to see if I'd respect that preference. I lowered the camera, kept it in my hands, but pointed it at the ground, a gesture of compliance I hoped would be understood. The creature nodded, another clear and unmistakable human gesture from something that definitely wasn't human. Then it raised one massive hand and pointed up the ravine, away from my camp and deeper into the forest. It wanted to show me something. The creatures moved ahead of me, leading the way up the ravine with a grace that seemed impossible for something so large. I followed, keeping my distance, but staying close enough to keep them in sight. My camera hung around my neck, unused but ready. We climbed for 20 minutes, moving deeper into the forest. And then we emerged into a clearing that shouldn't have existed. It was a graveyard with dozens of cairns arranged in careful rows, each one marking what I assumed was a burial site. But these weren't simple piles of rocks. Each cairn was a work of art. Stones carefully selected and balanced to create structures that were both functional and beautiful. Around each cairn, someone had placed objects including bones, carved wood, woven grass, and arrangements of feathers and stones that clearly held significance. This was a sacred space, maintained with obvious care and deep respect for the dead. The largest creature led me to a particular cairn, newer than the others, based on the lack of weathering on the stones. It gestured to the objects placed around the base, and I looked closer. There, partially buried in moss, was a camera, an older model from maybe 10 years ago. The strap was rotted through, but the body was intact. I looked at the creature, a question forming that I couldn't quite voice. It nodded again, that same eerily human gesture, and pointed to the cairn, then to the camera, then to itself. The message was clear. A photographer had been here before, had seen what I was seeing, and had ended up buried in this forest, honored in death by the creatures he'd tried to document. I knelt to examine the camera without touching it. The memory card slot was empty, but there was a name engraved on the bottom of the body. Thomas Bridger. I knew that name. He'd been a wildlife photographer for National Geographic, reported missing in the Olympic Peninsula in 2014. The creature made a sound then, low and resonant, and the others responded in harmony. Standing in that clearing surrounded by the graves of their dead, I somehow understood what they were telling me. Thomas Bridger hadn't gotten lost. He'd found them, and he'd made a choice. He'd put down his camera and stayed. The largest creature gestured again. This time to my camera, then to the ground, then back to the direction of my camp. Another clear message. I could leave. I could take my equipment and my memories and return to civilization, but the price of that freedom was silence. Or I could stay, could put down my camera and learn what Thomas Bridger had learned. I looked at my camera, at the device that had defined my adult life, and felt something crack inside my chest. What if some truths weren't meant to be captured? What if witness was enough? I made my choice. 3 days later, a park ranger found my truck at the trailhead with doors unlocked, keys in the ignition, and all my expensive camera equipment neatly packed in the back. They searched for 2 weeks and found my camp, but no sign of me. But I'm not lost. I'm exactly where I chose to be, living in the spaces between what people know and what they're afraid to believe. I've learned their language and attended their ceremonies. I've seen things that would revolutionize our understanding of intelligence. There's a new cairn in the graveyard now, and around its base, they placed my camera, carefully preserved and honored. Because I'd chosen witness over evidence, relationship over revelation, presence over proof. And in the quiet moments before dawn, I take pictures with my eyes instead of a lens. I capture moments in memory instead of memory cards. I photograph the and I'm finally, truly free. I froze, with my finger on the shutter button, caught between desire and disbelief. It had understood what my camera was, and had communicated a clear preference, waiting to see if I'd respect that preference. I lowered the camera, kept it in my hands, but pointed it at the ground, a gesture of compliance I hoped would be understood. The creature nodded, another clear and unmistakable human gesture from something that definitely wasn't human. Then it raised one massive hand and pointed up the ravine, away from my camp and deeper into the forest. It wanted to show me something. The creatures moved ahead of me, leading the way up the ravine with a grace that seemed impossible for something so large. I followed, keeping my distance, but staying close enough to keep them in sight. My camera hung around my neck, unused but ready. We climbed for 20 minutes, moving deeper into the forest. And then we emerged into a clearing that shouldn't have existed. It was a graveyard with dozens of cairns arranged in careful rows, each one marking what I assumed was a burial site. But these weren't simple piles of rocks. Each cairn was a work of art. Stones carefully selected and balanced to create structures that were both functional and beautiful. Around each cairn, someone had placed objects including bones, carved wood, woven grass, and arrangements of feathers and stones that clearly held significance. This was a sacred space, maintained with obvious care and deep respect for the dead. The largest creature led me to a particular cairn, newer than the others, based on the lack of weathering on the stones. It gestured to the objects placed around the base, and I looked closer. There, partially buried in moss, was a camera, an older model from maybe 10 years ago. The strap was rotted through, but the body was intact. I looked at the creature, a question forming that I couldn't quite voice. It nodded again, that same eerily human gesture, and pointed to the cairn, then to the camera, then to itself. The message was clear. A photographer had been here before, had seen what I was seeing, and had ended up buried in this forest, honored in death by the creatures he'd tried to document. I knelt to examine the camera without touching it. The memory card slot was empty, but there was a name engraved on the bottom of the body. Thomas Bridger. I knew that name. He'd been a wildlife photographer for National Geographic, reported missing in the Olympic Peninsula in 2014. The creature made a sound then, low and resonant, and the others responded in harmony. Standing in that clearing surrounded by the graves of their dead, I somehow understood what they were telling me. Thomas Bridger hadn't gotten lost. He'd found them, and he'd made a choice. He'd put down his camera and stayed. The largest creature gestured again, this time to my camera, then to the ground, then back to the direction of my camp. Another clear message. I could leave. I could take my equipment and my memories and return to civilization. But the price of that freedom was silence. Or I could stay, could put down my camera and learn what Thomas Bridger had learned. I looked at my camera, at the device that had defined my adult life, and felt something crack inside my chest. What if some truths weren't meant to be captured? What if witness was enough? I made my choice. 3 days later, a park ranger found my truck at the trailhead with doors unlocked, keys in the ignition, and all my expensive camera equipment neatly packed in the back. They searched for 2 weeks and found my camp, but no sign of me. But I'm not lost. I'm exactly where I chose to be, living in the spaces between what people know and what they're afraid to believe. I've learned their language and attended their ceremonies. I've seen things that would revolutionize our understanding of intelligence. There's a new cairn in the graveyard now, and around its base, they placed my camera, carefully preserved and honored. Because I'd chosen witness over evidence, relationship over revelation, presence over proof. And in the quiet moments before dawn, I take pictures with my eyes instead of a lens. I capture moments in memory instead of memory cards. I photographed the and I'm finally, truly free.
Thanks for joining me here at Dr. Bonechill. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Until next time, stay safe.